It's my great pleasure to chair this session, where we'll do a lot of interesting things, look at Cairo Genizah, calendars, analysis of the unprofessional square Hebrew script, and even have a chauffeur among us to tell us about his own experience. So I'm really happy and really excited to be chairing this session. Our first speaker is Dr. Nadia Vidro, who has a PhD in Hebrew Studies from Cambridge University, and is currently a postdoctoral research associate in the project Karaite and Rabbinite Calendars, Origins, Interaction and Polemic, funded by the Frits Thijssen Foundation at University College London. And she works on Jewish intellectual history and medieval manuscripts in Hebrew and Judeo-Arabic. Today, she will talk to us about calendars from the Cairo Genizah as a dating tool for paleography. So, Dr. Vidro, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Let me try sharing the screen. I hope it works as well as it did in the trial. Can you see this?
Yes, this looks perfect.
Lovely. Lovely. So I'm taking you to the Middle Ages because I'm a medievalist. And I will not be talking about paleography in the narrow sense, and you'll be glad that I don't, because I'm not a paleographer. But I will address a problem that came up again and again in previous talks, that is the paucity of dated or securely dateable sources for paleographic analysis. As I learned from your presentations, you have this problem with Dead Sea Scrolls and with Coptic and Greek papyri. And perhaps more surprisingly, we also have this problem with the Cairo Genizah. Although the cache itself is huge, hundreds of thousands of fragments, only a small fraction of them are actually dated or securely dateable. We have some legal deeds that are internally dated, and we have some texts with colophons. You have an example here. Those texts, those colophons are often detached from the text with which they initially came. And then we also have some texts that can be dated, not precisely, but on sort of circumstantial evidence, such as some letters, if the recipients or the addressee or some protagonists are known people, or texts in the hand of known scribes. Nevertheless, it is still a small proportion of texts that are dated or dateable, and additional dateable sources are always welcome. And it's one of the desiderata to look for additional dateable sources for paleographic analysis. And being a calendar scholar, among other things, I thought that one type of dateable sources could be calendars in the Cairo Genizah, and maybe not all types of calendars, but specific types of calendar compositions that we find in the Genizah. So we had a little project, and I say little project because it really was funded by a small research grant, so it was a small scale project, to look at calendar fragments preserved in the Cairo Genizah and try to distinguish between those that are dateable and those that are not. And once we've tested my hypothesis that certain types are dateable, we also assembled them, dated them, not on paleographic grounds, but on calendrical grounds, and presented them on a timeline as a corpus of dateable fragments to serve potentially as a tool for paleography. We've not done any paleographic research ourselves. So in this presentation, I'll try to convince you that some types of calendars are a good dateable source that can be used for paleographic research. And then at the end of the presentation, I'll show you our corpus a little bit that we put on the web page of the Taylor Schechter Genizah Research Unit in Cambridge University Library. Now, so that I can convince you that some types of calendars are a good dateable source. You need to know about some features of the Jewish calendar, and I'm really staying on the surface of it, so don't be scared. The image here is to entertain you with a little fun fact as well. At least I find it fun. So what you need to know about the Jewish calendar is that the mainstream Jewish calendar, the type that is also used today, that tells you that Passover was not that long ago, is based on a calculation of certain astronomical values known as moladot, and they are astronomical new moons plus a few other rules. To set the calendar by this calculation is a multi-step procedure that requires knowledge, but more importantly, it requires significant numerical abilities. People like Maimonides tell you that even school children can learn to set the calendar, but that's the basic principles. To actually deal with those numbers, large amounts of fairly big numbers, you really need significant abilities, and it's not that easy, and you just don't really do that when you don't need it. Another important fact is that the Jewish calendar isn't properly reiterative. That means that you can't calculate a calendar for, say, 20 years and keep reusing it. You could only do this if you calculated a calendar for just under 700,000 years. So the calendar calculation can be only accurately applied to those years for which it was performed. Now, equipped with this, let's look at various calendar fragments in the Cairo Genizah. We have lots of different types. We have calendar treatises that teach one how to set the calendar by calculation. We also have calendar polemics, and this is important because there are actually different medieval calendars, and people keep quarreling and arguing about which is the correct one. We also have all sorts of auxiliary calendar calculations that help you to calculate data that eventually will become the calendar. And we have the actual calendars. Those actual calendars are of two types. A small number of calendars try to respond to the problem that the calendar, the standard normative calendar, isn't reiterative. They notice that the closest when the calendar becomes the closest that the calendar gets to almost correctly becoming a cycle is 247 years. So they say, well, we'll just have a calendar for 247 years and we'll reuse it. It'll produce mistakes here and there, but it's better than nothing. Those calendars are very long-term, but they're also very concise. They provide only very little information about each year, so you can fit 247 years on one page. And then the majority of the calendars in the Cairo Genizah are calendar booklets that are based on a calculation, on the normative calculation, with a detailed description of the course of each year. And they also cover multiple years, although not as many as the 247-year calendars. Now, if you look at this list, if we were to claim that all these types of calendrical manuscripts are dateable, that would definitely be wrong, although all of them reference dates as examples or refer to some events. But things like calendar treatises and calendar polemics can be usefully copied years and hundreds of years after they've been composed. 247-year calendars are also, because they are erroneously perceived as reiterative, can be copied over and over again. Auxiliary calculations, you don't really know, it's more difficult to say, but the one type of calendar that is practically useless after its time of coverage are calendar booklets. So I argue that calendar booklets are actually dateable and can be used as a resource for any type of analysis, script analysis, where you need dateable documents. So what are these calendar booklets? today, when you buy a calendar, you generally get a calendar for 1 year. Medieval Jewish calendars are not like that. They cover ranges of years, and most commonly they cover sort of years that are multiples of 19 years, and this has to do with the structure of the Jewish calendar. But Jews also thought of 19 years as sort of a whole period. So if you have a calendar, you'll have it for at least 19 years normally. In those booklets, there's a full description of each year. If you can read this here, it'll tell you the date on the calculated moladot. It'll tell you when months begin, on what days festivals and fasts fall, and so on. So they're very detailed, and often they take from 1 page to 1.5 pages per year, so that a calendar for one 19-year cycle takes about 20 pages, which is very neat because it's, in Oriental manuscripts, it's 1 quire, 20 pages. If you have a calendar for more than one 19-year cycle, then you'll have maybe 40 pages, 60 pages. So they're detailed and fairly bulky. And you have those booklets in Hebrew and or in Judeo-Arabic. And by Judeo-Arabic, what I mean is Arabic in Hebrew characters. All examples that I gave in this presentation are in Hebrew because I expected the audience to be more comfortable with Hebrew, but the majority of them are actually in Judeo-Arabic, but still in Hebrew characters. Sorry, what have I done? There. Am I still okay? Now, so why do I say that they are dateable? Firstly, as I mentioned, the calendar isn't practically reiterative. So calendar booklets are not, what is happening to me? So calendar booklets cannot really be usefully copied after the time of their coverage. On the other hand, calendar calculations are complicated and long-winded, and people are unlikely to have prepared them for years far removed from the time of making. It's unlikely you go and prepare a calendar for 60 years ahead. Maybe you won't even be alive 60 years from now. I hope all of us will. And thirdly, calendar booklets are detailed and bulky, as I just showed you. So it's hard to imagine people copying pages and pages of information for years that have already passed. And as I said, this calendrical information isn't useful any longer. And they're also unlikely to copy it for years that are far in the future. So taken together, these three considerations seem to suggest that the starting date of a calculated calendar booklet reflects the time of the writing of the text, or at least the 19-year cycle, the group of 19 years of the writing of the text. And maybe not necessarily the beginning of this 19-year cycle, but somewhere sort of in this group of 19 years. You could say these are just my assumptions, and of course I need to provide some supporting evidence. So what can I provide as my supporting evidence? First of all, luckily we have calendar booklets with colophons. So you can compare the information in the calendar booklet with the date in the colophon. There are only very few examples, but in those that survive, you can see that the date in the colophon fits neatly with the dates covered in the calendar booklet, and usually falls near the beginning of the period that is covered by the calendar. Like in my first example, you have a calendar for 1161 until 1217, with the date in the colophon 1166 CE, and here you can see that it was copied slightly after the beginning of the 19-year cycle that started in 1161, but the scribe still included those past years simply because they belonged to his 19-year cycle, and that's one entity. scribes were less inclined to drop even past years if they belonged to their same 19-year cycle. Then you have interesting cases when you find records of personal events on empty pages in those calendar booklets, especially on the title page. For example, we have a calendar booklet the calendar started in 1108, that was copied for somebody known as the cantor Obadiah ben Aharon HaChaver. And on the cover page of this calendar booklet, Obadiah recorded the birth of his son, Chalfon ben Obadiah, born in exactly the same time when the calendar begins, 1108, and he also recorded his, unfortunately, subsequent date. And let me show you the calendar. So here's the calendar. Well, you'll have to believe me about the dates, unless you can quickly recalculate. So it's the calendar in the hand of the scribe, and at the end of this calendar, there's a colophon saying that it is written for somebody named Obadiah. And here in the hand of Obadiah, and the hand we actually know, he records the birth of his son, Yeled. He gives the date and all the usual blessings, and also the name at the bottom in Arabic. And then you can probably see that the whole record is crossed out. And at the top, he says, Niftar HaYeled, and the child has passed away. And because you see the record and see it crossed out, and then see the additional note of his death, you know it's not a copy of the birth record, if those at all existed in the Middle Ages. Sorry. But it's the actual thing. So you can see that the calendar fits nicely with the record of a dated event. And then we also have calendars in the hands of known scribes. And those always fall within the dates of the scribe's activity known from other sources. And I give here two examples of calendars in the hands of quite famous medieval scribes, famous in Fustat and in the Cairo Genizah, Chalfon ben Menashe and Yedutun Halevi. So there is quite a bit of supporting evidence that tells me that my idea that calendar booklets are actually dateable to around the period of the start of the calendar that they contain is correct. Now, I have here a slide that tells you how we actually dated them, but I won't spend time on this because I don't think I have much time. I'll only mention the problem that although I claim that, and I think that's correct, that most calendar booklets are dateable to the beginning of the calendar, to the beginning of the period that they cover. We don't always have the beginnings of those calendar booklets. So we don't always know when the calendar that is copied in them actually began. So you have to estimate, and my estimate is based on the fact that you don't really see those calendar booklets covering more than 3 19-year cycles, that is 57 years. And so if you're cautious and assume that all of them covered around this period, you can more or less date all of them to sort of 50, 60-year period, but often if you have more information about a calendar booklet, you can date it to a shorter period of time. Now, just a word about our corpus. Our medieval corpus consists of 84 calendar booklets in Hebrew and Judeo-Arabic, and they cover from the 10th to the early 14th century. Because of how the project was structured, I mainly worked on those collections that either belong to Cambridge or are curated at Cambridge, that is the Taylor-Schechter Genizah collection, the Lewis Gibson collection, and the Mosseri collection. But I also included joins from other collections. But I didn't include manuscripts that are not found in the Cambridge collections, even though you can see other calendars in other collections of the Genizah. So we reconstructed those calendar booklets as far as we could, dated them, arranged them chronologically, and presented with basic descriptions and links to digital images on the Cambridge University Digital Library website. And let me, I'll stop sharing the presentation and show you the website for a minute or two. Share. So on the Cambridge, on the Genizah website, under project, you have this resource that describes our methodology and explains how we dated calendars, but then you have a list of sort of a chronologically arranged list of calendars. It's still under construction. Not everything that we have in our database is already on the web page, but if you click on those that are clickable, it'll take you to the Cambridge Digital Library, and there you can see high quality, high resolution images, and also a better description. And in our description here on the page, we only included the dates that are actually in the manuscripts, our estimated dating, and a little bit of information which we thought could be useful. For example, the errors that I mentioned in the fragment, and those errors can sometimes be region specific, at least in some periods. We mentioned the languages and then the material, and sometimes also other comments. So if you're interested, at some point, you can go and have a look. Okay, let me go back to my presentation for just another minute. Share. Yeah, so what we have on the website is only the medieval corpus, and this will stay like that. But as I went through the calendars, I also collected an early modern corpus for 16th, 19th century. So if there's anybody in the audience who's interested in those, I have them, although they won't be displayed. And they are perhaps even better for paleography, because in that period, you get wall calendars for 1 year each. So there you really know that the calendar covers that particular year. Now, as I said, I'm not a paleographer. I put this corpus together, hoping that paleographers will find it useful. But I'm going to write an article about this. And if somebody is interested, if a paleographer is interested in looking at those calendars and co-writing the article with me, I'll be very happy. There's my email there. So this is what I wanted to present, really.
Thank you so much for a wonderful paper showing the implications of these calendars for paleographers. Until so far, I don't see any questions yet. So we have a couple of minutes. Estelle, was it?
Yes. Do we raise our hands for questions, or is that fine to do so?
Yeah, you can also let me know in the chat, but this is perfect. So please.
Thank you, Nadia. That was very fascinating, and I enjoyed that. My question is, and we see this a lot, and you did touch on it in Bible manuscripts, for example, which what I work on. Often the first page of a codex is, torn out, and then you aren't able to see it, or it's more damaged than the middle pages. Just out of curiosity, it's not a paleography question, but out of curiosity, what was the codicological format of these booklets? Were they inside a book? Were they on their own? Is the first page really damaged? How can we, are they very consistent in their having a 19-year span for a quire? I'm just interested if one quire is for an entire document, it seems quite unusual to me, so.
They have different formats and different lengths, obviously, but a lot of them try to stick to 1 page per year, and that makes a quire sort of a 20 pages for 19 years, which is neat. But then also many of them cover more than 19 years. They'll maybe cover another 19-year cycle. That'll be 38 years or 57. I've not seen them going further. So that'll be 3 quires maybe. But still, they're booklets. Obviously, as you know, in the Genizah, very rarely can you find a whole thing together, although some of them are almost complete, actually. So when I see a title page, it's often when I see the outer bifolio and maybe one other bifolio preserved somewhere else. It's rarely that I actually have complete booklets.
Thank you.
Our next question is from Ayhan Bakker. Ayhan, if you could unmute yourself.
Thank you. That was really fascinating. I was just wondering about this example that you brought about the son that was born at a specific moment that was inserted in the calendar, also dated. What are there other kinds of events or similar kinds of events recorded in the calendar? Is there a specific type of event? Is there a certain logic behind it? Does it also help in other ways for dating or for understanding the logic of calendrical thinking?
It's not very common for such events to be recorded somewhere. It's more common for people sometimes to say, this is our year. For example, he'll copy a calendar and then mark his year. And this is not necessarily the first year of the calendar, as I said, because they'll copy a calendar for a 19-year cycle. I think this birth record has more to do with not with copying calendars, but with a practice that is known also from other manuscripts, where on title pages or flyleafs, you record family events. You find it a lot in medieval manuscripts, later medieval manuscripts from Italy, for example. Sometimes if you have a manuscript with a flyleaf, you read a lot about the history of a family who owned this manuscript. So I think it's this sort of practice, not as much to do with the calendar, but on the other hand, especially because the child was born close to the beginning of the year, maybe the father wanted to have a calendar especially for his son, but the son couldn't use it in the end.
All right, thank you so much. If we have no other questions, then I suggest we move on. And thank you very much for your paper, and we're looking forward to hear more of this exciting project.